Dylan Reeves hadn't come to Lake Marlowe for tranquility, but he'd earned it, through sweat, grit, and the kind of years that don't give you a second shot unless you take it with your own hands. When he'd first driven out to the property, a sloping piece of land nestled between two ridges with a narrow gravel access road that dipped down to a tree-lined shore, it was overgrown, forgotten, and ignored by most of the buyers who'd seen the listing. The house was aged, weather-beaten, its roof slightly bowed, and the front deck half-rotten. But the dock, long, stable, anchored into the deep water with treated pilings and a handmade boathouse at its far end, was solid, the kind of thing someone had built not to impress, but to last. It was that dock, more than the structure itself, that made Dylan put in a cash offer the same day he visited. The place had been tied up in probate for nearly a year. The former owner, a retired railway engineer with no heirs, had passed away quietly in winter. No one came to claim the property, and it eventually went to public sale. Dylan moved fast. He didn't just want a weekend place, he wanted a buffer, a line between everything he'd done, lost, and outgrown, a place where he didn't owe anyone anything. The first few weeks after the closing were quiet. He hauled in new appliances, patched the roof, gutted the mildewed bathroom, and wired in better lighting with the help of a licensed electrician from town. His days were long and physical, and by the time the evenings came, he'd sit on the dock with a beer and a headlamp, watching the wind shift across the water like a silent animal brushing against the shore. There were no kids screaming, no streetlights buzzing, and no passive-aggressive meetings about fence height or garbage cans. That alone felt like victory. Dylan wasn't a recluse, he just didn't advertise himself. In town, he gave straight answers, paid in cash when he could, and didn't ask for credit. The marina knew him as the guy with the gray truck and a gut for engine noise. He didn't look for trouble and didn't expect any, which is why what happened next struck him not just as invasive, but as personally humiliating. The first time he saw the man on the dock, he thought maybe someone had gotten turned around. It was early, around 6:45 in the morning, and Dylan had just stepped outside with a thermos of black coffee. The sky was pink along the ridge, the water like glass, and the usual breeze hadn't picked up yet. He saw the figure seated in a folding chair near the end of the dock, rod in hand, a red bait bucket beside him. Dylan narrowed his eyes. He didn't recognize the man, older, in his late 60s maybe, wearing a flannel shirt and faded jeans, his back to the house. Dylan walked down the slope slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Morning," he said, once he reached the start of the dock. The man turned, looked him over, then offered a casual nod. "Karen said it was fine. Hope you don't mind." Dylan paused. "Karen?" "Lives next door," the man replied, gesturing vaguely to the left, toward a pale green ranch house just barely visible through the trees. "I'm her uncle. Grew up coming here summers, back when all this was open land. We used to fish right off this dock, way before there were even property lines." Dylan remained where he stood. "You're on private property." The man's expression didn't change. "She said it wouldn't be an issue. Said you just moved in." Dylan took a slow sip of coffee. "It is an issue. That dock was part of the property I purchased. It's legally mine." "Well, son," the man said, not unkindly, "I get that, but some things go deeper than paperwork." Dylan didn't reply. He watched the man reel in his line, nothing on the hook, then stand and gather his things. No rush, no guilt, like someone leaving a place they felt entirely entitled to. When Dylan brought it up later that afternoon, walking across the property line toward Karen's back deck where she sat arranging potted flowers, she greeted him with a broad smile, as if they'd been neighbors for decades. "Hi there," she called brightly. "I was just thinking I'd come over and introduce myself properly." "Your uncle was on my dock this morning," Dylan said, not smiling. "Oh, Harold? Yeah, he loves it out there. I figured it wouldn't be a problem. He's harmless, really. It is a problem. That's trespassing. Karen's smile thinned but didn't vanish. I mean, technically, but come on. It's not like you're using it at sunrise, right? I own it. I know. But Harold's family. He's been coming to this lake longer than most of us. It's just a dock, Dylan. No, it's my dock. The words sat there between them. Karen looked at him for a long beat, as if recalibrating. Then she said, I'm not trying to start anything. I just thought, as neighbors, there'd be some understanding. There is, Dylan replied, and that understanding includes boundaries. He turned and left. Behind him, he heard her call after him, lightly, as if half joking. You're going to make enemies fast with that tone, Mr. Reeves. That night, the dock was empty. Dylan stood on the back steps and stared down at it, arms crossed. It was just wood and nails and bolts, but it was his. He'd paid for every inch of it. And more than that, it was a line in the sand. It was where his ownership began and everyone else's opinion ended. Over the next few days, things were quiet again. No one on the dock. No footsteps near the boathouse. He started to believe maybe it had blown over. Then came the cooler. A battered blue Coleman cooler appeared at the base of the dock on Thursday morning. No note. No one in sight. But it was full. Beer, bait, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Like someone had claimed the space without even asking. Dylan carried it back up to the property line, placed it under a pine tree on the shared border, and left it there. It was gone by evening. Friday morning, he saw Harold again. Same spot, same posture, same damn folding chair. When Dylan approached, Harold didn't even turn around. He just said, Didn't mean to cause friction, son. This lake has a long memory. Some of us have earned the right to sit still. Dylan stared at the man. I don't care how long you've been sitting. You're not doing it here again. Harold stood up slowly. You could try being less territorial. Water's meant to be shared. Dylan's jaw tightened. The law disagrees. Harold picked up his bait bucket, muttered something that sounded like city folks never last, and walked off. That night, Dylan walked the property line with a flashlight. He didn't call anyone, didn't rant online. He simply checked the perimeter, secured the dock ladder with a chain, and added a hasp lock to the boathouse door. He wasn't going to be baited into theatrics, but he also wasn't going to be pushed around. He just didn't know, yet, how far Karen was willing to push. The weekend came with the kind of heat that stuck to your skin and made everything feel just a little more hostile. Dylan was outside early, stripping old sealant off the deck railing, when the first real sign that this thing wasn't going to fade away dropped like a stone into his path. From where he stood on the slope leading down to the dock, he noticed something new. 2 aluminum chairs with faded canvas seats had been positioned neatly on the dock, facing the lake. Between them sat the same blue cooler he'd returned to the tree line just a few days earlier. Next to that was a folded newspaper weighed down with a coffee mug, and most damning of all, a laminated sign attached to the boathouse door that read, Reserved for family use. Harold. The sign wasn't nailed or drilled in, but zip-tied through the handle like a quiet declaration of war, brazen in its childish simplicity. Dylan set his scraper down slowly. He walked to the edge of the deck and stared at the setup, jaw tightening. There were no people in sight, but it was only 7:30 in the morning. It was a message, deliberate and unhurried. We're not asking for permission anymore. He descended the steps, eyes never leaving the dock. When he reached the edge, he stood there for a full minute before ripping the zip tie from the handle with one sharp pull. The sign fluttered to the wood, landing face up, and he stared at it for another beat before folding it in half and taking it with him. Back at the house, Dylan placed the sign on his kitchen counter and called the county office to confirm his property lines, even though he already had the documentation filed in a thick folder in the hallway drawer. He The woman on the other end was polite and helpful, and within minutes confirmed what he already knew. The dock, boathouse, and adjacent shoreline were all part of his deeded parcel. There was no easement, no shared access, no ambiguity. Everything those chairs and that sign represented was encroachment, plain and simple. At 9, wasnt, he walked to Karen's house with the folded sign in hand. She was out front in a wide straw hat, tending to a flower bed with a small spade. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but tight at the corners. He held the sign out toward her without preamble. "This is over the line, Karen," he said. She didn't take the sign. Instead, she dusted her hands on her shorts and stood upright. "Dylan, you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be," she replied, her tone clipped. "That dock has been part of this community longer than either of us. You think because you've got a piece of paper you can just erase everyone else's history?" "I'm not erasing anything," he said, lowering the sign. "I'm enforcing property rights. You and your uncle are trespassing." "Harold is 72 years old," she said, as if that excused the entire situation. "He doesn't have many places left where he feels connected. He's not hurting anyone. He's not entitled to something just because he feels nostalgic about it." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're being deliberately hostile. The lake used to be friendly. People shared. We didn't have all this fencing and locking and claiming." Dylan stepped closer. "That may be how it used to work, but that's not how it is now. I didn't build the rules. I'm just following them." Karen turned and picked up her spade. "Maybe you're the kind of man who thinks rules mean everything. Around here, relationships used to matter more." "Not when those relationships are one-sided," Dylan said quietly. He walked away without waiting for a reply. Later that day, Dylan drove into town and picked up a lockable storage bin and a set of motion-activated lights. If they wanted to act like it was open season on his property, he was going to make damn sure the boundary was clear. He wasn't about to install fences or chain-link barriers. It wasn't about turning the place into a fortress, but it was about principle, about deterrence, about sending a quiet, firm signal. This ends here. That night the air was thick and humid. Dylan stood on the deck sipping a beer, eyes on the dock, which was now dark and unoccupied. The chairs and cooler were gone. He'd placed the storage bin near the top of the slope with a sign that read, "Private property, no access without permission." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confrontational. But it was clear. Just after midnight, Dylan woke to the sound of footsteps. Not inside, outside. Muffled, slow, deliberate. He moved to the bedroom window and lifted the corner of the blind. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the slope and part of the dock, and what he saw twisted his stomach. There, seated calmly in one of the aluminum chairs, was Harold. Shirtless now, wearing only a pair of old shorts and a baseball cap, legs stretched out, fishing rod propped in front of him. He looked completely at ease, like he belonged there more than Dylan ever could. Dylan stood there for a full minute, breathing slowly, before he quietly dressed, walked down the hallway, and stepped out the side door. He approached the dock with even steps, not trying to be stealthy. The planks creaked as he got close, and Harold turned his head slightly but didn't move. "I saw the sign," Harold said without looking back. "Guess that was for me." "It was," Dylan said. "I thought about ignoring it, but I figured, better to be civil." Dylan stood behind him, arms crossed. "You're on private property," he said again, more slowly this time. "I've been coming to this lake for 50 years, Harold said. "Used to walk this stretch barefoot when it was just a dirt path and wild grass. And now it's not," Dylan said. "Now it's mine, legally. And I'm asking you to leave." Harold turned to face him finally. His face was sun-darkened and weathered, eyes sharp but not hostile. "You can't buy belonging, son." "I'm not trying to. But I damn well bought this dock." Harold stared at him for a long moment. Then, wordlessly, he gathered his things again. The tackle box, the chair, the old rod. He stood, bones creaking with effort, and stepped off the dock without another word. By the time Dylan returned to the house, he felt no satisfaction, just tension. A tight coil of frustration wound tighter by the second. He wasn't looking for a fight. He just wanted the boundary to be respected. But Harold and Karen weren't interested in fairness. They were interested in entitlement, what they believed they were owed by history, by habit, by the comfort of familiarity. The next morning, Dylan found the cooler again, this time placed directly on his porch. Taped to the lid was a note written in clean block letters. "We're not trying to start trouble, just trying to keep things the way they've always been." Inside was a 6-pack of domestic beer and a tin of homemade cookies. A peace offering disguised as provocation. He didn't touch it. He didn't respond. That same day, a man in a pickup truck pulled into Dylan's driveway around noon. He was unfamiliar, with a long ponytail and a clipboard. When Dylan stepped outside, the man introduced himself as Brian from Lakeside Maintenance Services, said he'd been asked to inspect the dock for shared use approval. Dylan blinked. "Shared use?" "Yeah," the man said. "Lady next door said this dock was historically communal. Wanted us to check if it's compliant for multiple households." Dylan let out a long breath. "You can tell her there's no such thing. It's private property. She doesn't have a claim." Brian gave an uncomfortable smile. "Not my place to say. I just inspect structures. But you might want to clear that up soon. If it's disputed, things can get tricky." He left without setting foot on the dock. That night, Dylan installed a camera facing the slope, not to collect evidence for court, not to wage some kind of war, but to ensure that whatever came next, he saw it coming. Because what was once an annoyance was becoming something else, something stubborn, persistent, and deliberate. This wasn't just about a dock anymore. This was about ownership. And Dylan was done being polite. By Monday morning, Dylan had grown used to checking his perimeter before making coffee. It was an ugly habit, born of necessity, the kind of thing that made you feel less like a homeowner and more like a watchman. He walked the slope slowly, scanning the dock, the shoreline, the base of the trees. Nothing seemed disturbed, no cooler, no chairs, no Harold, but something felt off. It wasn't until he reached the end of the dock that he saw it. 4 brand-new stainless steel cleats had been bolted into the far corners of the structure, one at each end, perfectly positioned for mooring a boat. Dylan knelt to inspect one. The bolts were fresh, the metal unweathered, and there was a faint smell of sealant. Someone had installed them overnight. And, not amateurishly, these were drilled clean, tight, aligned. It wasn't vandalism. It was infrastructure. He stared out at the lake for a long minute, wind brushing the surface, water lapping quietly against the pilings. Then he stood and walked straight back to the house, heart pounding not with panic but with a cold, clean anger. He called the sheriff's office, not to report a crime but to document a pattern. The dispatcher took down the information with professional boredom and told him an officer could come by that afternoon. Dylan said that would be fine. Then he called the county land office again, this time requesting copies of any applications or filings made concerning the shoreline or the dock in the past 2 weeks. The clerk hesitated, then told him nothing had come through under his name. Dylan clarified, "Check under the neighbors." The woman took a beat, then confirmed that a Karen Whitmore had submitted a letter of interest regarding community shoreline enhancement, with a sketch attached, an informal note, not a permit application. It had no legal bearing, but it existed. At 3:30 that afternoon, Deputy Sean Fraser arrived in a dusty Ford Cruiser, early 40s, polite but efficient. Dylan walked him down to the dock, pointed out the cleats, the previously zip-tied sign, and the verbal interactions he'd had with Harold. Fraser nodded along, jotting notes in a small spiral pad. He didn't say much until they reached the boathouse. "You got any signage posted?" Dylan gestured toward the sign near the slope. "Private property, no access without permission." "That'll help," Fraser said, "but only so much. If they're saying it was community access before, and now it's changed, folks might think the rules are up for debate." Dylan looked at him sharply. "There is no debate. The dock was never public. I have the deed, and there's no shared access clause." Fraser raised a hand in a calming gesture. "I get that, but not everyone thinks like a surveyor. Some think history overrides paperwork. Doesn't mean they're right, just means they act before asking." "So what happens if they keep coming back?" Dylan asked. Fraser shrugged. "You can press trespassing charges. We can issue a warning first. If they damage anything again, that's vandalism. If they try to force use of the dock, you might be able to file for an injunction. Just depends how far you want to push." Dylan was quiet for a second. "Let's start with the warning." That evening, Fraser visited Karen's house. Dylan didn't watch from the window, didn't eavesdrop. He stayed inside and waited. 20 minutes later, the cruiser pulled away. 5 minutes after that, his doorbell rang. He opened it to find Karen standing there, not angry, not yelling, just cold. "So, this is how it's going to be now?" Dylan said nothing. "You're calling the police like I'm some kind of criminal over a couple cleats? They were drilled into my dock." "They're for safety," she said sharply. "There's a kid down the shoreline who almost lost a kayak last week. Harold was trying to help." "Then Harold can help on his own property." Karen folded her arms. "You're poisoning this neighborhood." "You know that?" "No," Dylan replied. "I'm protecting what's mine." She stared at him a second longer, then turned and walked away, muttering, "It's always the new ones who ruin everything." The following day, Dylan installed a solar light at the end of the dock, aimed outward. He didn't need surveillance. He needed presence. A visible deterrent. Let them feel watched. Let them think twice. But the escalation didn't stop. 2 nights later, around midnight, he was woken by the sound of something striking the deck, a dull, metallic clatter. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped out into the dark. The wind had picked up, and clouds were moving fast across the moon, shadows slipping across the trees like ghosts. He moved silently to the edge of the slope, light off, listening. Another clatter. He flipped the switch. The beam caught movement. Someone running. A figure scrambled off the dock and bolted across the shared yard toward Karen's property. Dylan ran down the slope, light bobbing with each step, and found what had made the sound. 6-foot sections of PVC pipe stacked in a pile near the boathouse along with nylon rope, a package of steel carabiners, and a folded blue tarp. Floating platform materials. He turned off the light and stood still, breathing hard. He wasn't sure which was worse, the blatant trespass or the planning behind it. This wasn't impulse. This was construction. He didn't call the police this time. He took the materials, carried them up the slope, and locked them in his shed. The message had already been sent, but his patience was gone. The next day, Dylan drove into town and met with a real attorney, not just a clerk or a county official. The lawyer's office was quiet, paneled in wood, with ceiling fans that creaked like they hadn't been serviced in years. The attorney, middle-aged and methodical, read over Dylan's deed, looked through the photos, and nodded slowly. "You've got a solid case if this escalates," he said. "But if you're asking whether you can stop someone from standing on your dock in the meantime, that's trickier. It's civil, not criminal, unless they damage something or refuse to leave after being told." "So, what do I do?" Dylan asked. Document. Continue notifying the sheriff's office. Build a paper trail. If it comes to court, you'll want a pattern of enforcement. And you might want to post a letter formally revoking any perceived implied access rights. Dylan nodded. "Then I'll do it." When he returned home, he typed the letter that evening. Clear, formal, unemotional. A copy was taped to a wooden stake at the top of the slope, another mailed to Karen's address with delivery confirmation. The message was final. Access to the dock and shoreline was private and prohibited without written permission. For 2 days, nothing happened. No movement, no chairs, no sign of Harold. Then came Friday afternoon. Dylan had just finished patching the underside of the deck stairs when he noticed a group of people on the shared boundary line. 4 of them standing near Karen's fire pit. Lawn chairs, drinks in hand, music playing faintly from a Bluetooth speaker. It looked casual at first. Then he saw what they were pointing at. The dock. More specifically, the boathouse. One of the men gestured broadly, making some kind of exaggerated motion with his arms like outlining a shape. Another held a tablet. Dylan squinted. They weren't just socializing, they were planning. He walked down, silent, not approaching, just watching. They didn't cross onto his land, not then. But they stood there for over 30 minutes, discussing, gesturing, looking toward the water with the kind of entitled ease that set his teeth on edge. That night, he moved the boat. Not far, just 10 yards down the shoreline, where it could be moored using a temporary anchor system he'd set up months ago. He left the dock bare, clean, stripped of chairs, loose lines, and gear. Then he locked the boathouse. Saturday morning, he woke to find a note nailed to the base of the dock. "If you want war, you'll get it." It wasn't signed, but it didn't have to be. Dylan didn't show the note to the sheriff, not yet. He folded it once and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, along with the printouts of his deed, the warning letter he'd posted, and photos of the cleats and the PVC pile he'd locked away. There was something about reporting that message, especially without a name or face behind it, that felt like handing off control, like stepping into a game someone else had invented. And Dylan wasn't interested in being reactive anymore. He didn't want to chase them, accuse them, or ask for help unless absolutely necessary. What he wanted, what he needed, was to get ahead of whatever they thought they were building. He started with the drone. Not a cheap toy store model, but the kind realtors used for land surveys and insurance assessments. It wasn't flashy, just a functional gray machine with a stable gimbal and a 4K camera. Dylan had picked it up months ago when he was inspecting the roof, but hadn't flown it since. That morning, he sent it up over the tree line, keeping it within the legal altitude, sweeping across the lake, scanning the adjacent properties. It wasn't about spying, it was about information. He logged footage, paused when he saw the fire pit gathering from 2 days earlier, replayed the movement of arms, traced where they had stood. It gave him a new perspective, not just physically but strategically. He saw how exposed his dock was from the cove angle, how the neighboring shoreline curved inward just enough to allow unmonitored approach by boat or kayak. By late afternoon, Dylan had mapped out a new layout for motion lighting and installed a secondary post, farther back from the slope, but angled to catch anyone approaching from the side. He reinforced the boathouse lock and placed a waterproof case beneath one of the deck planks with a laminated copy of his land boundary in case the sign was ever removed or damaged. Then he took the cleats out. All 4, wrenched them loose with a socket wrench and sealed the holes with marine-grade filler. He didn't want any part of their infrastructure left behind as evidence of precedent. Let them rebuild it on their own land if they were so determined. 3 days passed without incident. Then, on the 4th morning, the drone picked up something new. At the far end of Karen's dock, a smaller, weathered structure that jutted only a few feet into the water, Harold stood alongside a younger man, someone Dylan didn't recognize. The 2 of them were measuring something, talking animatedly, and beside them sat a stack of materials: lumber, sealed containers, metal poles. Dylan zoomed in, took a still frame, and stared at it for several minutes. They weren't just planning a floating platform, they were preparing to build it. What made it worse was what came next. That afternoon, Dylan received an envelope in his mailbox with no return address. Inside were 2 photocopied sheets. The first was an unsigned document labeled Community Access Initiative, Informal Agreement, listing various shoreline parcels, including his, under a loose proposal for cooperative lakefront use. It was nonsense, full of vague language and wishful phrasing, not filed with any authority. But the second page was what caught him off guard. A map, annotated by hand, showing dotted lines extending from his dock out into the water with the words Shared Zone scrawled across it. Dylan felt something tighten in his chest as he reread the word. Shared. It was their thesis, their argument, their moral anchor. Not legal, not official, but rhetorical, enough to confuse people, to manipulate narrative, to weaponize perception. It was the kind of move that didn't rely on fact, but on fatigue, on making the target so worn down they eventually caved just to end the noise. But Dylan wasn't built to cave. He didn't respond. He filed the papers with the others, took screenshots of the drone footage, and instead called someone he hadn't spoken to in over a year. Garrett Milton, a former colleague from his contracting days who had pivoted into marine construction. Docks, seawalls, anchoring systems. Garrett didn't live nearby, but he'd handled legal installations all around the state and understood the boundaries between private and shared waters better than most of the bureaucrats who approved them. Dylan explained the situation without emotion, sent over the footage, and asked one thing. Come out, walk the site, and tell him if anything about this felt like it couldn't be defended. Garrett arrived 2 days later. Big, bearded, calm. He wore a high-visibility vest and carried a clipboard, purely for optics. Together they walked the slope, the dock, the water line, and after an hour, Garrett gave his verdict. They're not just bluffing, he said. They're building up to a claim. Not legal, more like a grievance they hope becomes consensus. Dylan nodded slowly. So, what would you do? Garrett scratched his jaw. I'd outbuild them. Make the dock unapproachable. Not bigger, just smarter. Controlled access, reinforced flotation, maybe an offset entry point. Nothing aggressive, just tight, confident, like you're not inviting negotiation. Dylan didn't ask how much. He just said, let's do it. They started the next morning. By the time the neighbors noticed, the new mooring system was already in. Dylan said nothing. Karen didn't speak to him. Harold walked past once, very slowly, then turned around and disappeared. That night, Dylan sat on his newly stabilized platform sipping coffee in the dark, the water calm beneath him, the lights of the cove flickering like distant warnings. He wasn't escalating. He was finishing. The lake had always been quiet before sunrise. Dylan had come to rely on that silence, not as a luxury but as a condition of equilibrium, something foundational to the peace he'd fought to restore in his life. But that morning, before the sky had even begun to shift from navy to gray, he was startled awake by a low mechanical noise, steady, deliberate, and out of place. He sat upright, fully alert. It wasn't the whir of a distant engine or the hum of someone's boat warming up. It was grinding, rhythmic, something physical moving in water. He slipped on boots, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped outside into the pre-dawn murk. The sound grew louder as he moved down the slope, cutting through the darkness like a pressure in the air. When he reached the bottom, he saw it. 2 kayaks tethered together by a web of rope and PVC pipes, slowly dragging what appeared to be a makeshift floating deck toward the edge of his property. On that platform, standing with one hand gripping a wooden pole and the other pointing toward the shoreline, was Harold. Youre. The construction was crude but calculated. A wide sheet of plywood bolted to empty drums, stabilized with crossbeams and trailing a mesh net behind it like a rudimentary breakwater. Harold looked straight at him as the thing approached the outer boundary of Dylan's dock. Not a trace of surprise in his face, only a grim satisfaction. He wasn't just fishing. He was attempting to stage a presence, an occupation in motion. Dylan didn't yell. He didn't move. He simply watched as the raft drifted to within 10 feet of his structure and then stopped, anchored by a set of cinder blocks that were quietly lowered into the shallows by the men in the kayaks. One of them, young, early 30s, tattooed forearms, glanced back at Dylan with a smirk. They weren't hiding. They weren't breaking in. They were establishing precedent, and they were doing it in plain sight. Dylan turned and walked back up the hill. Inside, he didn't grab his phone or make another legal call. He opened the drawer where the original boundary papers were stored, took out the laminated copy, and walked back down with deliberate, steady steps. When he reached the dock, Harold was now seated on a cooler, sipping from a thermos. "This is harassment," Dylan said flatly. Harold didn't look at him. "This is water. You don't own the lake." "I own access from this dock," Dylan said, holding up the laminated sheet. "You're creating an obstruction within the reach of my structure. That's interference." "You can quote your deed all day," Harold said, eyes still on the lake. "But the water remembers everyone. We're not building on your land. We're just here. You're constructing a physical structure with anchoring components less than 15 feet from a private dock. That's not just here. That's intentional." At that, Harold finally turned. "You keep treating this like a courtroom. Out here, people don't care about technicalities. They care about who respects what." Dylan took a step closer. "Then you'd better respect this. I will not let you push me into retreating from my own property." "You don't have to retreat," Harold said, standing slowly. "You just have to accept that you're not the only one who belongs here." Dylan didn't respond. He turned and left. But this time, it wasn't to get a tool or prepare another countermeasure. He knew escalation was no longer a matter of if, but how far and how fast. He needed a line that wasn't just legal or defensive. He needed action. By midday, the raft had drifted slightly but remained tethered. Karen appeared briefly, pacing along her property line, arms folded, watching Dylan from a distance like a coach observing a rival player. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Her posture was triumphant, her silence a declaration. When the sheriff's deputy arrived that afternoon, a different one this time, younger, clearly less interested, Dylan explained the situation and was met with polite indifference. "As long as they're not physically on your dock, sir, it's technically not trespassing," the deputy said. "That raft isn't moored to your property. And unless they're causing obstruction to navigation or damaging something, it's a gray area." "So anyone can build floating structures and park them within spitting distance of my shoreline?" Dylan asked, incredulous. "I didn't say that," the deputy replied, "but water laws can be tricky." "Would it be tricky if I tied a raft to the back of their cars and left it on the street overnight?" The deputy gave a small, tired smile. "Probably." When he left, Dylan stood on the dock for a long time, staring at the raft. The sun was sinking now, and Harold had been replaced by the younger man who lounged across the platform like it was a damn patio. Music played from a Bluetooth speaker, muffled but audible. Dylan clenched his jaw. He didn't yell, he didn't throw anything, but in his mind, something irreversible clicked. That night, Dylan waited. At 3:15 a.m., he walked to his truck, backed it down the slope as close to the water as he could, and began unspooling a length of heavy-duty marine-grade rope. He had planned this already in his head. Run the cable through the underside of the dock, around the left pilings, tie off the raft at 2 points, then slowly haul it toward open water using the engine torquing of his winch. Not to steal, not to sink, just to remove. If they claimed it was public space, then fine. Let the damn thing float freely. Let it drift out into the middle of the lake where no one could pretend it was part of his shoreline. He worked quickly, without rage, without noise, attaching the steel hooks beneath the raft's frame, threading the rope through the blocks they'd left behind. When he activated the winch, the strain pulled slowly but surely, and the raft creaked as it shifted off its moorings. It resisted at first. Then it moved. That was when Harold popped up from the deck. He had been lying flat, unseen, beneath a tarp. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, half asleep, lurching forward. Dylan didn't stop. He kept the winch moving, slowly dragging the structure away from the dock. Harold scrambled, grabbing for his pole, yelling something about sabotage, assault, rights, but the raft was already moving, water sloshing beneath the drums, ropes taut. "You want to float?" Dylan called out. "Fine, let's float." Harold stumbled, grabbing a cooler for balance as the raft pulled out into deeper water. He screamed. Not words, just noise. Raw, primal fury. Dylan didn't respond. He disengaged the winch once the raft had cleared the edge of his dock's reach and allowed it to drift naturally, wind taking it. Harold sat in the middle, soaked, furious, and helpless. Dylan walked back up to the house, heart hammering but steady. He didn't sleep. By sunrise, the raft had been picked up by a passing patrol boat. No charges were filed, no arrests made, but the image of Harold, wet, stranded, shouting across the lake, spread like wildfire among the neighbors, not through gossip, but through silence. No one came to Karen's defense. No one gathered on her lawn again. Even her most vocal sympathizers began crossing the street when they saw Dylan walking to his truck. The line had been crossed, but not by him. It was crossed when they assumed his silence meant surrender. The lake wasn't the same after that morning. There was no shouting from across the water anymore, no sudden appearances on the dock, no signs left like messages from another side of a conflict no one wanted to admit was over. Instead, there was quiet, tense, bitter, loaded with the silence of those who'd lost the power to deny what had happened. Harold had been rescued, yes, and no one filed a formal complaint. But the act had left its imprint deeper than any lawsuit. He hadn't just been towed, he'd been exposed. Not humiliated by Dylan's hands, but by his own sense of untouchability unraveling in full view. The community that once saw him as a harmless eccentric now saw him as a man who had pushed too far and been pulled back by his own rope. Dylan didn't take a victory lap. He didn't gloat, didn't speak to neighbors or post signs. He simply returned to the dock, removed the remaining unauthorized cleats, reinforced the access ramp with an angled bar lock, and installed one final addition. A motion-activated spotlight mounted atop a galvanized post that lit up the slope and water's edge like a theater stage whenever someone moved within 20 feet. The message was clear and cold. This is not a suggestion, and I will not repeat myself. Karen, for her part, kept her distance. In the week following the incident, she was seen only once near the edge of her property, trimming overgrown shrubs with furious precision. She never looked up when Dylan walked past. She never approached. Whatever plans she had laid with Harold were now reduced to the kind of community awkwardness that lingers long after a fire's been put out. The air still smoky with everything that almost burned down. But Dylan knew better than to assume silence meant surrender. Karen had proved herself capable of patience, of deflection, and, most dangerous of all, of using perception like a weapon. That Friday, a letter arrived in Dylan's mailbox, not handwritten this time, but typed and stamped with the seal of the Marlowe Property Standards Committee. He opened it slowly, half expecting threats, accusations, or a rehashing of the raft incident. Instead, it contained a formal inquiry. A review had been initiated concerning the visual and environmental impact of recent modifications made to his dock, including the lighting system, mooring structure, and access gate. The letter stated that a concerned resident had submitted photos and a statement suggesting Dylan's updates detracted from the shared visual harmony of the lakefront, and may pose a navigational safety concern to non-property holding recreational users. Dylan laughed once, short and bitter. Of course, not a direct attack, not a legal action, but bureaucracy. Slow, grinding, impossible to kill once started. He wasn't angry at the committee. He knew their type. Well-meaning, meticulous, always ready to pursue structure over substance. But the timing, the language, the phrasing, it all had Karen's fingerprints. He wasn't going to play defense. Not again. That evening, Dylan assembled everything. Copies of his deed, photographs documenting each stage of his modifications, certified invoices from Garrett's Marine Service, county code citations regarding private lighting allowances, and, finally, footage from the drone. Clear, wide, dated. He placed everything in a manila envelope, walked to the home of the committee's acting chair, and handed it over in silence. The man thanked him, promised a fair review, and said they'd be in touch within 10 business days. Dylan nodded, turned, and walked back into the rising dark. What happened next wasn't an escalation in force. It was something quieter and, in its way, far more dangerous. The following morning, Dylan noticed a boat drifting near his property. It wasn't moored, it wasn't docked. It hovered. A lone man sat inside, engine off, letting the current carry him closer to Dylan's dock before adjusting his oars to maintain proximity. He wasn't fishing. He wasn't sunbathing. He was watching. He stayed for nearly 40 minutes, then rowed away. The next day, another boat. Different person, different angle, no interaction, just presence. Dylan recognized it for what it was. Karen hadn't sent more rafts. She hadn't nailed signs. She'd sent people, unaffiliated, silent, detached, floating reminders that he was still being watched, that his victory wasn't total, and that his dock remained a point of interest in a community that liked things more shared. It was psychological. Pressure, ambient harassment designed not to provoke but to wear down, drip by drip. But Dylan didn't rattle. He documented every visit, noted every timestamp, kept every drone clip. 3 days later, he filed a formal cease and desist request through his lawyer, not directed at Karen, but addressed to the entire Lake Association registry. It named no individuals, only behaviors. Repeated unauthorized watercraft loitering within a defined radius of a private dock, attempts to initiate surveillance-style observation without consent, and indirect harassment through coordinated but nonverbal presence. It was worded clinically, but its teeth were sharp. The committee, sensing the paperwork war spiraling, suspended their review. Karen, now isolated, made her final move. One evening, just before dusk, Dylan found the boathouse door ajar. The lock hadn't been broken. It had been carefully cut and placed beside the entrance, like someone wanted him to know it wasn't theft. Inside, nothing had been taken. But in the center of the floor, left on top of a folded tarp, was a weathered photo in a frame. It showed a much younger Harold, sitting on what appeared to be the same dock 30 years earlier, a boy beside him, Karen, perhaps, as a child. There was no note. Just the picture. Dylan stood there for a long time, holding it. He wasn't moved, he wasn't shaken, he was done. He placed the photo back in the tarp, wrapped it tightly, and left it at the edge of the Karen's property, under a pine tree where she'd see it first thing. Then he replaced the lock. The next day, he added a floodlight facing the boathouse and wired a backup camera to a battery system with cellular sync. The message was clear. Whatever memory they believed they were honoring, whatever tradition they'd weaponized, would not be honored at the expense of his ownership. It was over. The last of the leaves were beginning to brown when Dylan finally let himself breathe. It wasn't peace exactly, not the kind that washed over you like resolution at the end of a long storm, but it was something steadier, more grounded, stability. For weeks now, no one had set foot on his dock without permission. No makeshift platforms had appeared. No phantom boats had lingered just outside his legal perimeter pretending to fish or idle while really keeping vigil. Karen had gone quiet. Harold had disappeared entirely, not even emerging for his usual early morning walks. Whatever reaction they'd expected when they left that photo in the boathouse hadn't come. Dylan hadn't lashed out, hadn't confronted, hadn't even acknowledged it. He had simply returned it without sentiment, without anger, without ceremony. That, it seemed, had been the real blow. Because people like Karen needed engagement to stay relevant. They fed on the push and pull, on your reactions, your attempts to reason, your anger, your lines drawn in the sand. But when the line became a wall, quiet, firm, unyielding, they didn't know where to go next. The silence became heavier than any words they could throw. Dylan still walked the slope every morning, still scanned the edges of his shoreline, still checked the motion lights and battery backups. Not out of fear, but out of principle, because vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was protection. The dock no longer felt like a contested zone. It felt like what it had always been intended to be, a space of pause, of breath, of control, not the center of a war, but the end of one. He rebuilt the deck chairs, sanded them smooth, stained them to match the dock. He kept one bolted into place and left the other free-floating, easy to move but hard to steal. There were still signs posted, private property, no access, but now they blended into the wood, part of the landscape, like fixtures rather than statements. They no longer felt like a warning. They felt like truth. One afternoon in late October, a man from the committee dropped off a final letter. It was short, almost reluctant. The inquiry had been dismissed. No violations found. The lighting was within code, the structure improvements permissible. The language was careful, formal, devoid of any acknowledgement of what had prompted the investigation in the first place. But Dylan didn't need an apology. The dismissal was enough. He placed the letter in the same drawer with the rest of the documentation. The deed, the drone footage, the letters, the photos, a thick file, a record of where the boundary had been tested and how it had held. He never saw Harold again. Rumor had it he'd moved in with family 2 towns over, health slipping, mobility worsening. Dylan didn't celebrate it. He didn't need to. Karen still lived next door, still kept to herself, still mowed her lawn in straight, angry lines. They nodded occasionally, a ritual of pretense both seemed content to maintain. She never spoke first. Neither did he. Some boundaries didn't need to be redrawn. They only needed to be recognized. The lake changed with the season. The tourists thinned. The boats quieted. The wind picked up in a different key. Dylan stood on the dock one evening with a thermos in hand and looked out over the water. The surface was still, but he could feel the shift beneath it. The new equilibrium. The fragile but real balance that came not from compromise, but from assertion. This was never about anger, never about dominance. It was about space. Ownership. Not just of land, but of peace. And you didn't protect peace by hoping people respected it. You protected it by being ready for the day they didn't. He sat down slowly in the bolted chair and stretched his legs out toward the water. The sky above him was streaked with cold orange light, and the trees along the ridge swayed in long, deliberate motions. There was nothing left to guard. Not now. But he would anyway. Because he knew better. Because the next storm, when it came, would come quiet. And when it did, he'd already be here. Watching. Waiting. Ready.